Chapter 6. The Soul. We have thus far discussed the nature of the sense objects together with the mind, in and by which they appear. There are two more subjects needing to be discussed, namely the individual soul and God. We shall first consider the former. We have picked up in the course of life certain notions about the soul. We need to see how far these notions are based on evidence. Most of us believe that there is a soul, the perceiver of the sense objects, which make up the outside world, and the thinker of the thoughts that arise in the mind. We also take it for granted that there is a distinct soul inhabiting every single body. It is this soul that we regard as the self. And as this self is limited to a single body and the associated mind, we take it to be finite. When we say I, we mean this little self. We also believe that we, namely these little selves, are in bondage, being subject to the laws of space, time, and causality. Some of us believe also that this little self can become free, though we do not all mean the same thing by the word freedom. Most of us believe that this self takes up a succession of bodies, not by its own will, but by the compulsion of the effects of actions. Further, there is the almost universal dogma of the believers that the souls are distinct from God. A few believe that this distinction will vanish on the attainment of freedom, but all others believe that the distinction is eternal, that the soul will remain distinct from God forever and ever. These believers do not question the reality of time and space and of this and other worlds. All these believers assume that the mind is the self. But this assumption is often subconscious. Quite a large number of them profess to know that there is a self other than the mind, but subconsciously they believe that the self is a mind of some sort, attributing to their self many of the properties of the mind. If these believers be substantially right, then it would follow that the self is a person, that is, an individual. All the questions that arise about the self are thus reducible to the one question: is the self an individual or person? If he be not a person, then there is no soul, no perceiver of the world, enjoying and suffering the consequences of actions. Whether personality is real or not will appear from what the sage tells us in his writings. It is as follows. The body by which itself is inert does not say I. The real consciousness has no rising nor setting, but between these two there arises a spurious being, an I, which assumes the size and shape of the body. This itself is the mind, serving as a knot between consciousness and the inert body. This is conditioned existence, the ego, bondage, and the subtle body. This is the real nature of the so-called soul. The sage tells us here that the real consciousness is beyond time and therefore neither rises nor sets. It is like the sun, which, relative to the earth, does not move. The sunrise and sunset we speak of are due to the movements of the earth. So too the reality shines constantly. The rising and setting of the ego are ascribed to it. The ego's sense is discontinuous. It rises and sets. Apart from the ego's sense, there is no individual soul. It shines during waking and in dream and sets in sleep. This little self is therefore not to be identified with the reality, nor can it be identified with the inert body. What then is this little self? The sage tells us here that it is a hypothetical being, a chimera of the mind, compounded of the light of consciousness and the body. These two utterly unlike things are confused together. The result is this incongruous being called the individual soul, which says, I am so-and-so. Because of the light of consciousness associated with it, it appears conscious. But at the same time, it is indistinguishable from the body which has no consciousness of its own, because of the two incongruous elements of which it is composed. It is described as the knot between the reality, the self, and the body. That is why the little self is manifest as the ego's sense, which has the form of the thought, I am this body. The body thus identified as the self is not always the physical body. Sometimes the mind, which is only a subtler kind of body, takes its place, and then the sense of selfhood is restricted to the mind for a time. Now the thought, I am this body, is the primary thought. It is like a thread on which all the other thoughts are strung. Hence, the ego is indistinguishable from the mind. In fact, the mind is but an expanded form of the ego. Hence, the sage tells us that the mind and the subtle body are the same as this hypothetical little self, which is no other than the ego. Conversely, we say that the little self is not other than these. We thus learn that the so-called soul is nothing but the ego, which is due to a confusion of two elements which are distinct and can never mix, because one of them, the body, is non-existent, being a mere mental image. There can be a real mixture only if both the elements be real. The mixing up of the two, explains the sage, is like a marriage contracted by a bachelor in a dream where the bridegroom is real but the bride is not. When the dreamer awakes, he finds himself as much a bachelor as before. Hence, the real self, who is the reality, does not really become limited. He never really became the soul or the little self. He was not really married to the body. Thus, it is made clear that the individual soul has no real existence. All those questions that relate to that soul are meaningless, because they assume the existence of a soul. There is only one real self, the pure consciousness which is beyond time. We shall see later on why he is described as consciousness and not as conscious. We shall then see that there is a fundamental difference between the two descriptions. Since the mind has no existence apart from this spurious entity, the ego, it follows that all the creations of the mind, including ignorance and bondage, and the consequent conditioned existence consisting of enjoyment and suffering, which we call life, are outgrowths of the ego and partake of its unreality. That ignorance is unreal will be seen later on. That this teaching is correct will be clear to us if we look at the facts without bias. By the most careful analysis of the whole of our past experience, we can find no proof of an individual soul other than the ego. The ego itself is just the primary ignorance, the recognition of which is the starting point of our inquiry. It is here shown that it is an imaginary entity, being a compound of two uncompoundable elements. Thus, the whole of this conditioned existence, which we call life, is founded on this lie, the individual soul. It is natural, therefore, that life should be full of lies and therefore full of disappointments. This teaching may be difficult to grasp, but it is the fundamental truth as taught by the ancient lore. There can be no correct understanding of the ancient lore if this teaching be not accepted. So long as the notion of individuality is retained, all philosophical inquiries are bound to prove useless, for they cannot lead us out of the primary ignorance. This was clearly taught by the sage Shankara as follows: only so long as there is an identification affected by the mind of the real self with the intellect is there an appearance of individuality and of conditioned existence for that self. But in reality there is no such being as the individual soul, other than the spurious entity imagined by the intellect. in the study of the Vedanta, we do not find support for the existence of any conscious entity having an existence of its own, apart from the Supreme Being, who is ever free and all-knowing. The sacred texts say, "There is no seer, hearer, thinker, or knower apart from this being. There is none but he that sees, hears, thinks, or knows. Thou art that. I am the reality." These and hundreds of other texts are our authorities. The ego is the only source of all our life experiences. They are what they are because of the ego. We say, "I am so-and-so. I am a doer of actions. I am happy. I am miserable," and so on. In every single thought we can find this "I am." It is in fact the common factor of all thoughts without exception. No thought can arise which does not contain this "I am." But this "I am" is not a property of the mind. So we learn from the sage and from Upanishadic lore. We are told that this "I am" is the light of the real self. That self being infinite and unqualified, this "I am" is not really the little thing we take it to be. And we take it to be limited, imperfect, and bound to the wheel of pleasure and pain, only because we do not discriminate and distinguish the element of reality in the ego from that which is false. Hence, it ought to be clear to us that what obscures the real self is simply the acceptance of this ego at its face value, as our true self, which it is not, as shown here. This was exactly the essence of the teaching of the sage known as Gautama Buddha. He was once asked by someone about the immortality of the soul. The sage replied, "That soul about whose survival you are anxious does not exist even now. It is unreal." What he meant was that the questioner was assuming the existence of an individual soul, which does not really exist, and hence the question was based on falsehood. Buddha did not mean to deny the existence of the real self. The questioner misunderstood the answer. He thought that the sage had told him that there is no self at all. He ought to have asked a further question. Is there a real self? And if there be one, what is its real nature? He did not do so, but went away. And Buddha discovered that he had unsettled the man's faith without enlightening him. The fact is worthy of note that when questions are based on a false assumption, it is not possible to answer them by a simple yes or no. Either answer would be wrong. The individual soul being unreal, it follows that there is no perceiver of the world. This may be surprising, but it need not be so. The seer and his spectacle are inseparable. They are like the two ends of a single stick. As a stick will always have two ends, so every perception involves the two, the seer, and his spectacle. The three, namely the seer, the spectacle, and the relation of seeing, form a triad, of which the essential element is the seeing, which becomes possible by the light of consciousness. By that light, both the seer and the seen are manifested. It is not possible to attribute reality to the seer while denying it to the spectacle. If we accept the view that the spectacle, namely the world, is unreal in any sense, then we must also accept the view that the seer of the world is unreal in the same sense and to the same extent. The spectator is in fact an integral part of the world. Both in waking and in dream, the spectator and the spectacle form one single whole, appearing and vanishing together. The sage brings home to us the spurious nature of the ego, the individual soul, by means of a parable. On the occasion of a marriage, an uninvited guest, an utter stranger to both the parties, came in pretending to be an intimate friend of the bridegroom. At first the host, namely the bride's party, believed him and honored him accordingly. But after a time suspicions arose and inquiries began to be made as to who he was and what right he had to come in. The two parties met and began to question each other. The impostor saw that he was sure to be exposed and treated as he deserved if he remained, so he quietly disappeared. Just like the impostor in this parable is the ego. It is neither the real self nor the body. So long as no inquiry is made, the ego persists and enjoys the status of the real self. But when an inquiry is made, when the quest of the real self is begun and persisted in, it will vanish, leaving no trace. This is exactly what we are told by the sage in the following passage. This ego, which is but a ghost without a form of its own, comes into being by taking hold of a form. Keeping hold of the form and enjoying sense objects, it waxes greatly in strength. If the truth of it be sought, it will run away. We need to study this teaching carefully. There is no ego in sleep, but only in waking and dreaming. In both these states, the ego manifests by taking hold of a body, saying, I am this body. That is, there is a perception of the body, and at the same time there arises the thought, I am this body. That body is taken as the self, or as the abode of the self, and the other bodies and objects that are seen at the same time are taken as not self. When again sleep comes on, both the body and the ego disappear, and with them the world also vanishes. Thus the ego is simply the ignorance that limits the real self to a single body out of a multitude of bodies, all of which are its own creation. This world which it creates is thus divided by the ego into two parts, as self and not self, the former being a very small part and the latter a very large one. From this arise the twin notions of I and mine, which are the substance of bondage. Bondage is the outcome of the limitation of the notion of the self to be a single body. Hence it is evident that but for the ego there can be no bondage. It thus becomes easy to accept the teaching of the sages that the real self is ever free, never became bound or subject to ignorance, and does not need to be made free. The sage, having no notion of being other than the real self in its utter purity and perfection, is not aware of bondage. He is not even aware of having been bound at any time, because time itself has been transcended by him. Bondage is just a thought like any other thought, though it needs to be said that the thought of bondage has its uses in that it leads wise people to this inquiry, which leads through the quest of the self to the realization that there is no bondage. But since bondage is inherent in the ego sense itself, it will not cease so long as the ego itself survives. Thus we have the curious result that the ego is itself bondage, as well as the sufferer from it. It follows from this that the ego is forever debarred from the enjoyment of deliverance. How can bondage ever become free? Besides, in that state, only what is utterly real can survive, and the ego is not real. Those that nourish the hope of winning deliverance without losing individuality are doomed to disappointment. In fact, the blessed regions which they hope to win and in which they are to retain their individuality are as unreal as this world. What has been said about bondage applies also to ignorance, because this also is identical with the ego and has no existence apart from the ego. We need to realize in all its implications the fact that the ego itself is the source of all the evil that besets life. But to most inquirers, the ego is dear as life itself. because they think it is themselves and do not want to lose it. They would rather suffer all the ills of life than be happy without it. Questions are framed, assuming the immortality of this non-existent soul and its survival in deliverance. These will not arise if the teaching be understood. One such question arises thus. There is the Vedantic teaching, thou art that. Formerly this teaching was kept secret and imparted only to well-tested disciples. Thus the serious mischiefs arising from a misunderstanding of the teaching were prevented. But nowadays, the sacred lore is accessible to all, and the consequences are far from desirable. For the higher the teaching, the greater are the evils due to its misapplication. Incompetent persons read the books and assume that the ego itself, with all its vices, is infinite, all-powerful, and above the law of right and wrong, and they cannot be set right. Even the better sort of inquirer is puzzled by the teaching because he has not yet clearly understood the truth that there is no individuality. He takes the sacred text as meaning that the individual soul is God or whatever else there is that is infinitely great. But he doubts the teaching because, in the sense in which he understands it, it is not only absurd, but blasphemous. And he is right in this. He is certainly far more in the right than those who accept the teaching, but in the wrong sense. The better sort of student has an instinctive sense that something is wrong. He is assailed by doubts, and he puts questions to get them cleared. Such a one asks the sage, "If I am eternal and perfect, why am I ignorant?" The sage replied as follows, "Who is ignorant? The real self does not complain of ignorance. It is the ego in you that so complains. It is that which also asks questions. The self does not ask any question. And this ego is neither the body nor the real self, but something arising between the two. In sleep, there was no ego, and you had no sense of imperfection or ignorance then. Thus, the ego is itself imperfection and ignorance. If you seek the truth of the ego and thus find the real self, you will find that there is no ignorance. What the sage meant was that if the real self be found, the ego would be extinguished, and that the ignorance complained of will be extinguished along with the ego. The correct meaning of the sacred text, "Thou art that," as given by the sage, is recorded in the Guru Ramana Vachanamala as follows: "Thou art not the body, nor the senses, nor the mind, nor the vital force, nor the ego. Thou art that which will shine as the pure I am, when, by the renunciation of the original sin, which is just a notion of selfhood in these, and by the quest of the real self, the mind is utterly extinguished in the heart, and the world ceases to be seen." Incidentally, it may be noted that the ego itself is the cause of all that vehemence of belief which engenders fanaticism and intolerance, and a taste for vain and even rancorous controversies. The religious man is ego-ridden, just like his more agreeable brother, the skeptic. The latter is indifferent and therefore not disagreeable, but the religious man is rarely at ease because he sees so many people believing differently from himself. He ardently looks forward to a time when all men shall be of one religion, but he cannot bear to think that that religion shall be in the least different from his own. He would rather that other people should be without any religion than that they should cherish a religion not his own. Hence it happens that the more intensely religious a man is, the more unpleasant he is likely to be to those who differ from him in religion. If he obtains political power, he will persecute all that profess other religions. That is because Religious belief is not inimical to egoism. The religious man always thinks that his zeal for making converts is a virtue. It is not a virtue at all, but a vice, because this zeal is due to his egoism. He does not say to himself, "This faith seems to be true and good, so it shall be mine till I know better." On the contrary, he says to himself, "This is my faith, and therefore it alone is true, and it is the duty of all men to accept it." Thus, his attachment to his own faith is egotistic. That is why there is rancor in his condemnation of other faiths. The existence of those faiths is an insult to him. Orthodoxy is my doxy, and heterodoxy is the other man's doxy. Such is his mentality. Thus it happens that many a believer harbors a greater dislike for those that differ from him even slightly than even for non-believers or for believers in a totally different religion. This is pointed out by the sage in the following. He that has not attained the state of perfect identity with the reality, which is his natural state, since that reality is ever shining in the hearts of all creatures as the real self, by seeking and becoming aware of it, engages in controversies, asserting there is something real. No, that something has form. No, it is one. It is twofold. It is neither. From this we understand that the sage has no creed of his own, and the reason is that he is egoless. The ego is itself the believer or unbeliever, as the case may be. The ego-ridden ones are divided into two broad divisions, those that deny and those that assert the existence of a reality underlying the changing phases of the world, including therein the threefold appearance, namely the soul, the sense objects, and God. The asserters again fall into numerous subdivisions, because they differ as to the nature of that reality. The main differences are mentioned here. In the first place, there is conflict of beliefs about the reality of form. There are those who assert that the first cause has form. Naturally, this is denied by some. Then there is the controversy about the unity or diversity of that cause. Some assert that the first cause is one, and that the universe is an appearance in it, so that it is both the material and the efficient cause. Others deny this, and assert that the first cause is God, who is eternally distinct from the souls. There are still others who maintain that God and souls are neither identical nor distinct. Among these, the believers in unity are also mentioned, because that teaching, though true enough, is not intended to be cherished as a mere dogma, but as an incentive to the attainment of actual experience of the reality. Those that are averse to the quest by which the experience is to be won are therefore no better than the others. All are equally subject to the ego and content to remain so. In truth, only experience of the self is real, not beliefs about him, which imply that he can become an object of thought. Mere theoretical knowledge of the self, even that derived from the sacred lore, is ignorance, just like the dogmas of the devotees. What the sage means is that the reality transcends the mind, while creeds are purely mental. Therefore, no creed can be a faithful description of the reality. The reality is neither in the creeds nor in the books in which they are set forth. The believer is just the ego, whose nature is to hide or distort the truth. I believe, says the believer. To him the sage says, find out the truth of this I, the believer, then thou wilt know the truth that transcends the mind, and therefore cannot be contained in a creed. We thus see that the ego is the primal seed of all this manifoldness, not only of the world of objects, but also of the world of ideas. This is a logical extension of the conclusion that we have arrived at in the last chapter, namely, that the world is mental. Since the mind has no existence apart from the ego, it follows that the ego itself is both the mind and the world. This is just what the sage says in the following. When the ego rises, then all the world comes into being. When the ego is not, then nothing exists. Therefore, the quest of the self, by way of the question, who is this ego, or whence does he come into being, is the means of getting rid of all the world. The teaching conveyed here should be considered along with that conveyed in another passage quoted in the last chapter. There, the sage told us that the plurality of selves appearing to us in ignorance is an illusion, and that this plurality would cease to be seen when the ego is extinguished by the quest. Thus, we get the result that in the state of deliverance there is no world, whether of things and persons or of thoughts, that the whole world is in the ego and is nothing but the ego. This is in perfect agreement with the teaching of ancient lore, which is clearly expressed in the Mandukya Upanishad, which says that he is worldless, blissful, calm, without difference. There are other equally clear statements in the ancient lore, which assert the utter absence of difference in the egoless state. There is no manifoldness at all here, and this is impressed by warnings to the seeker of the truth not to get entangled in the false belief that differences are real. We are told that whoever takes differences to be real shall die again and again. He that imagines the least difference between himself and the truth shall be the victim of fear. Whatever is conceived by one as other than the self has the power to deceive him. That the world ceases to appear on the attainment of deliverance is also asserted by the sage in the following. I shall now state clearly the profound secret which is the supreme essence of all Vedanta. Understand that when the ego dies and the real self is realized as the one reality, then there remains only that real self, who is pure consciousness. This is also in accordance with the teaching of the Gita, which tells us that even now the world does not really exist. All the creatures are in me, I am not in them. In truth, they are not in me. Such is my divine Maya. On the other hand, while the ego sense survives, the world appearance is inescapable. And conversely, so long as one sees the world, one cannot help confounding the body and the self, and assuming that the self is finite. And this is worse for those who cherish the false belief that the world is real as such. And in this there is no real difference between him that thinks that the body is the self and him that thinks that the mind is the self. The latter is always thinking of the body as the self, most of the time, just like the former. Thus it happens that people in the West speak of a dying man as giving up the ghost. They do not say that he is giving up the body, which they would say if they were free from the delusion that the body is the self. But though the ego is itself ignorance, and the origin of all sin and suffering, this ego has very great importance in our inquiry, because it holds the clue to the finding of the real self. Thus, we shall see in the course of the description of the quest of that self. Besides, the ego is the proof of the real self. These points are brought home to us by the sage in the following. This insentient body does not say, I. No one ever says, I did not exist in sleep. But all this comes into being only after the rising of the ego. Seek therefore the source wherefrom the ego rises, by concentrating the mind on the quest. The first step in the quest of the real self is to understand that self is not the body, physical or mental, The reason for this is twofold. On the one hand, the body is unconscious and hence cannot be the self, finite or otherwise. On the other hand, we are sure that the self, whatever it may be, can exist without a body. We know that this is so in sleep. Few people can even imagine the possibility of self ceasing to exist during sleep. Those that do so are the over-sophisticated ones. Their perplexity on this point is dealt with in a long talk given by the sage to a doubter, which will be given later. Thus, the ego itself is a proof that we exist. We are not the ego. We are that from which the ego takes its rise. That must be found by seeking the source of the ego. Revelation tells us that if and when we find that source, we shall find not only the self, but also the reality that underlies the world appearance. And this will be the case because the self and reality are one and the same. The ego is thus seen to be the arch-deceiver, the true Satan or Ahriman. He is the only enemy of God and man. He is the enemy of right knowledge. He is the inventor of murder and lying. He is the cosmic Macbeth, who is constantly murdering peace, which is true happiness. He is the impostor who has usurped the seat of the real self. Therefore, he is debarred from entrance into the state of deliverance, the kingdom of heaven that is in us, taught by Jesus. The sage has told us that the ego is all the evil there is, while egolessness is all the good there is. From the ego, which is ignorance, proceed all the evils that beset life. All that is good and worthy of reverent cultivation belongs to egolessness. Apart from the ego, there is neither death nor rebirth. This vicious circle of deaths and rebirths is sustained only by the primary ignorance, which is the ego. The ego itself is death, because he is the negation of the truth, which is life. He must not only be dethroned, but must be put to death, for there is no safety so long as he survives. The ego must become considerably attenuated for the teaching of the sages to be understood. This is clear from the following utterance of the sage. He was explaining the true inwardness of the current notion that a disciple must, after finding a guru, remain with him for a long time, serving him faithfully, and surrender himself utterly to the guru, and that the latter would then teach him the great secret. Thou art that. The sage explained it as follows. The true meaning of what is here called surrender is the complete wearing away of the ego sense, which is individuality. And there is a necessary condition for the disciple being able to receive the teaching. For if there be no surrender in this sense, the teaching is sure to be misunderstood. Even with the limited egoism that now exists, man is liable to outbreaks of fury, to be tyrannical, fanatical, and so on. What will he not do if he be told that he himself is that great being? He would not understand that teaching in its true sense, but would take it to mean that his individual soul, the ego, is that great being. This is not at all the true sense of the teaching, because the ego is simply non-existent. The true meaning of the teaching is that though the soul as such is a non-entity, there is in it an element of reality, namely the light of consciousness proceeding from the real self, and experienced by us as I am. This light of consciousness does not belong to the soul. It belongs to the self, the reality. It must therefore be surrendered to him. When that surrender is complete, then that self alone will remain. And if individuality be thus lost, it is well lost, For this loss of individuality is not a loss. It is the loss of the greatest of all losses, the loss of the self. It is therefore the highest of all possible gains, the gain of the real self. The effect of this surrender is thus described in the ancient lore. As the rivers flowing into the ocean, and therein losing name and form, become one with the ocean, so does the sage, losing name and form, become one with the Supreme Being who is the transcendental reality. Even leaving aside the truth that the ego is unreal, it has to be said that what the sage has lost is just a mathematical zero, while what he has gained is the infinite reality. This is expressed by the sage as follows in one of his hymns to Arunachala. What profit hast thou got, O Arunachala, taking me, of no worth here and hereafter, in exchange for thyself, the greatest of all gains? The surrender to the real self, to become final and perfect, needs to be affected by the quest of the real self in the manner taught in a later chapter. And since surrender is the culmination of devotion, the seeker of deliverance needs to cherish devotion to the real self. When this devotion becomes perfect, then it will be possible to enter on and persist in the quest till success is won, till the real self reveals himself. Chapter 7. God. We come to the conclusion that two out of the three subjects of our inquiry, namely the world and the soul, are unreal as such. We need to inquire now into the truth of the concept of God. This part of the inquiry is very easy, because the conclusion is not in doubt. The three, namely the world, the soul, and God, are one single indivisible whole, because each implies the other two. In fact, the first member of the world includes the second and third. The name world means the totality of all distinct objects of thought. It implies and includes all inanimate objects, all sentient creatures, and the one cause of all these. The world of persons and things is an effect, the experience of which is inconceivable without the cause that permeates and sustains the effect, just as you cannot perceive a pot without being aware of its cause or set of causes. Thus it happens that the three are practically one for this inquiry. We cannot regard one or two of these three as unreal and the remainder as real. An ancient analogy is that of the hen, which has been given to us by sage Shankara. He points out that one cannot cut her into two, intending to cook and eat one part, and to reserve the other for laying eggs. He should forego one of these purposes and be content with the other. That is, he must cook and eat the whole hen, or keep her alive for laying eggs. Just in the same way, we must reject the whole of this threefold entity as unreal, in the special sense of the word is used in the Advaitic metaphysics, or accept the whole of it as real in the sense in which materialists as well as theists call it real. There is no middle course. The idea of God is relative to the ideas of the world and the soul. The world, restricting it to the totality of insentient objects, is the opposite of God, in that it is inert and without consciousness, whereas God is endowed with infinite consciousness. The soul is opposite to God, because it is finite, as compared to God, who is infinite. Thus God is a member of two pairs of opposites, and opposites have an existence only for the ego mind. Therefore God is not an objective reality. There is another consideration also. Considered as one of the three, not as he really is, God is an object of thought. He is one of the triad of relation, namely the thinker, the object, and the act of thinking. And all triads exist in the realm of ignorance by virtue of the ego. Therefore God is not an objective reality. This is clearly expressed by the sage in the following. The triads all arise, depending on the ego's sense, so too arise the dyads, pairs of opposites, if one enters the heart by the quest of who am I, and sees the truth of it, the real self. All of them will vanish utterly. Such a one is a sage. He is not deluded by these. If we can abstract from the world these dyads and triads, then nothing will be left of it, except perhaps space and time. And these two we have seen are not objective realities. What remains over on the extinction of the ego is the real self alone, which is not divisible into parts. Here we have one more proof of the unreality of God as such. It is asserted by the sages that separate from the real self there is no God in the egoless state, and separateness is the very essence of the idea of God as God. In fact, where there is no separateness, there can be no ideas at all. God, as he really is not an object of thought. The truth about God is that he is no other than the real self, otherwise described as the reality and as pure consciousness. As he is not a person and is not related to the world of persons and things in any way. The relation of cause and effect, which is usually said to exist between the reality and the world, is not real at all. If the reality were related in any way to anything, it would not be the reality, as defined by the sages. That God, as he really is, and the real self are one and the same, is the central theme of the Upanishads, as we have seen from the text cited by Shankara. This identity is not merely stated as a fact, it is emphasized in all possible ways. Penalties are decreed for those that do not receive the teaching, and blessings are pronounced on those that accept the teaching and earnestly strive to realize the truth in their own experience. He that serves a separate deity, thinking he is one and I am another, is ignorant. He is like a quadruped for the gods in heaven. When one becomes immovably fixed in identity, without fear, with this invisible, unembodied, indefinable placeless one, then he attains fearlessness. When one makes the least division in this one, there is fear for him. That is the real cause of fear, in the case of him that wrongly knows the truth of the self. He that sees as if there were difference here goes from death to death. God, as he really is therefore nameless, formless, and without attributes of any kind. If he had attributes, he would be in relativity, and therefore unreal. This is the ultimate truth about God as revealed by the sages. Of course it gives rise to an apparent difficulty in giving an account of creation. The difficulty is got over by the sage Shankara, by distinguishing between the reality in its true nature and the same conceived for the purpose of teaching as the origin of the world. The former is Para-Brahman, and the latter Apara-Brahman. They are also called Nirbija and Sabija, Nirguna and Saguna. The latter is also called Ishwara, or the personal God. There are those who confound the two and claim that he actually became all this multiplicity. They rely on texts of the ancient lore which literally understood and without any reference to the final teaching, as conveyed by the other texts occurring later in the same books, seem to be in their favor. The commentaries abound in arguments to show that a literal interpretation of these texts is improper. The question is set to rest for us by the clear utterances of the sage of Arunachala. One such pronouncement of the sage is as follows. Even the statement that duality is real, so long as one is striving to win the goal, but that in the goal there is no duality, is not at all correct. What else but the 10th man was the one in the parable, both when he himself was anxiously seeking the 10th man as one that was missing, and when he had found himself to be the missing 10th man. Here the word even signifies that a creed not mentioned is also wrong. That is, the two different creeds are here condemned. One of them is implicitly condemned and the other explicitly. The first one is that duality is true always and persists even in the state of deliverance. The second is that duality is true for the present and until non-duality is achieved by some method of spiritual endeavor. The former is the creed of the dualist. The passage cited above takes it as unquestionable that this creed is incorrect, having regard to the direct experience of the self in the egoless state, which the sages have. The latter is also incorrect, because of the peculiar definition of reality that the sages have given. If duality were real in the sense of the definition, it would endure forever. There would be no possibility of non-duality realized or brought about by any means whatever. Besides, if non-duality in the egoless state be allowed to be an effect of the pursuit of the quest or other means, then it would be unreal, having a beginning. It would have an end. An effect can endure only so long as it is sustained by its causative force. It is an axiom of the Upanishads that a finite cause, a course of activity, can never produce an infinite effect. The authors appeal to our common experience to prove this, if proof be needful. It is nobody's case that the state of deliverance is other than endless. Even those who conceive of that state as becoming a denizen of the world of some sort do not allow that there is to be a return from it to a lower state of existence. Those dualists that maintain the continuance of difference in deliverance are at least logical in their claim. Of course, they are unable to fit into their creed the testimony of the sages. They achieve their object by rejecting that testimony. Those dualists that seek to reconcile the experience of the sages with their own creed are up against a dilemma. If they claim that difference is real while ignorance persists, they would have to say that deliverance has a beginning, but they are unwilling to admit the inevitable consequence that it would also have an end. If they admit that it is both beginningless and endless, they would be logically driven to the conclusion that difference is altogether an illusion, as the Advaitists say. The parable referred to is as follows. 10 men from a village crossed a river, and then they counted themselves to make sure that all had safely crossed over. But as each man left himself out in the counting, it seemed to them that there were only 9. So they concluded that the 10th man was lost. While they were bewailing the lost man, someone came up to them and inquired the cause of their sorrow. They told him that there should be 10 of them, but that one was lost. The newcomer found that they were mistaken. He counted exactly 10, and he saw also how it was that they came to think there were only 9. They had made a mistake in the counting. To convince them that they were 10, he asked someone to count the strokes he would deal on their backs. The last stroke he reserved for the counter. When the latter had counted 9 strokes, the stranger dealt one to him also, and thus 10 strokes were counted, showing that there were 10 men in fact. If the counter had counted right before, he would have found that he himself was the 10th man. So he was the 10th man all along, both before and after his discovery. No new man was brought from elsewhere. He that was the 10th at the time of his discovery was the 10th even before. So the real self is the only reality all the time, both before and after the extinction of ignorance. The truth is, ignorance is no more an existing thing than its products, the world, the soul, and God. Ignorance does not exist for the real self. It is a mere hypothesis, which is used as a means of conveying the teaching. We have seen that ignorance is no other than the ego, which has no existence at all. Hence, ignorance, the origin of all creation, does not exist even now. The real self is the one without a second all the time, even now. That is, he is worldless. Therefore, it is not open to us to entertain the belief that the reality suffered a real change, that it really became the three. If it could have suffered a change, it can never save us from the vicious cycle of change which we want to escape. Rightly was it said by Gautama Buddha that if there be not an unchanging and unchangeable reality, there can be no deliverance for us from samsara, relative existence. He declared that there is an unchanging and unchangeable reality and that therefore we can obtain deliverance. If we admit that the reality is changeless, we must also admit that it is not the cause, material, or efficient of the world, and its being undergoes no change of any sort. This is the truth of God. God is conceived by the devotees as only relatively real, as we shall see in the chapter on devotion. We have seen before that he that looks upon God as a person regards himself as a person. We have seen also that the personal God must have a form, gross or subtle, physical or mental. Personality means existence in one's own right, as a being separate from all other beings. The claim to such existence is based on the ego sense. The ego mind is aware of itself as conscious and intelligent. This consciousness is not its own, but a minute fraction of the consciousness which is the self, just as the light of the image of the sun seen in a mirror is a minute fraction of the sun's own light. The notion that the mind or soul is a conscious entity is described in the sacred lore and by the sage as an act of theft. This theft has to be undone by surrendering to the reality of the mind, with the ego reflected in it, by understanding that the reality is the self. This is the meaning we are told to find in the last line of the Gita teaching. This means, take refuge in me, surrendering all your dharmas. Here dharma is to be taken in a wider sense than usual. It does not mean duties or conduct. It means status or attributes. The soul is a bundle of attributes. The first and the foremost of these is personality. This has to be surrendered, says the sage. The manner of this surrender is the quest for the self.